A controller's momentary lapse in concentration puts two commercial airliners on a potential mid-air collision course in the skies overhead Boston's Logan International Airport. What follows is the story of the worst mid-air collision in aviation history, which, thankfully, never actually happened, due in no small part to the quick reaction of one very observant individual, who ultimately not only saved his own life, but also those of the other 447 souls involved. This is a story of systemic failure, human fallibility, and no small measure of sheer good fortune. Opened on September 8, 1923, Boston's Logan International, originally known as Boston Airport, was initially used by the Massachusetts Air National Guard, with the first scheduled commercial operation between the city and New York only commencing 4 years later in 1927. As time progressed during the 1940s and 50s, an increase in passenger numbers saw the airport expand into Boston Harbour. This expansion has continued, not without controversy or sporadic conflict with the local community, right up until the present day. Indeed, one of the runways which will play a significant part in the events we are about to review, that being runway 15 right, 33 left, was in itself extended on artificial land to just over 10,000 feet, nearly 3,100 metres long, in so doing making it the longest of the airport's 6 runways. With such a large number of runways available, the coordination of arrival and departure traffic can at times be complex. When weather conditions allow, the primary arrival runway of choice will be runway 04 right, with 04 left being available as a secondary or supplementary alternative if needed. With aircraft landing on these runways, the designated runway for departure will be 09. However, at a mere 7,000 feet or just over 2,100 metres in length, it is often too short to facilitate many of the airport's larger, heavy intercontinental departures. Under such circumstances, these departures will be reassigned to either runway 04 right or alternatively runway 15 right. During the summer months of 2005, average traffic movements totaled about 1,350 per day, about 90% of which being jet transports, bringing that year's total passenger numbers to just over 27 million, making it the 37th busiest airport in the world at the time, and the 19th busiest in the US itself. These numbers having increased still further to nearly 43.5 million by 2024. With these figures steadily increasing year on year, it has not surprisingly resulted in an ever-increasing upward trend of aircraft movements. Ever more arrivals and departures using the same finite piece of land, sandwiched between the city to the west and the waters of Boston Bay to the east. Add bad weather into the mix, either at Boston itself or at destination airports down route, and congestion at the airport can at times reach uncomfortably high levels, bringing obvious additional pressures to bear on an already stretched air traffic control system. The evening of June 9th, 2005 was one such example. With the eastern seaboard of the US experiencing significant thunderstorm activity, not uncommon for this time of the year, many aircraft were effectively stranded on the ground at Boston, simply unable to get airborne because their intended destinations were unable to accept them given these prevailing weather conditions. Had these aircraft remained on stand, this would undoubtedly have alleviated some of ATC's congestion headaches. However, with arriving aircraft then having nowhere to deplane their passengers, this solution would merely be swapping one problem for another. As a result, departures were pushed and held remotely, usually on taxiways, being subsequently moved around like pieces on a chessboard as takeoff slots gradually began to open up and aircraft were shuffled out to take their place on the departure runway. Set against this backdrop, two almost simultaneous departures that evening, Aer Lingus Flight 132 to Shannon and US Air Flight 1170 to Philadelphia, were ultimately involved in an airborne near miss, which was to highlight the ever-present risk of human fallibility and expose as grossly deficient those procedures which were put in place to supposedly mitigate against just such an occurrence. This is the true story of the most disastrous mid-air collision in aviation history, which thankfully never happened, thanks to the timely intervention of one very self-aware and clued-in crew member. Parked up at Logan's Terminal E, the crew of the Aer Lingus A330 finalised their pre-departure cockpit preparations, just as the local time passed 7 p.m. that evening. In command and occupying the left-hand seat would be Captain Roger O'Shea, a highly experienced instructor and Czech airman with literally thousands of hours under his belt, many of which had been obtained on the A330 type. The remainder of his crew would comprise of Senior First Officer Mark Egan, a cabin manager and 9 additional cabin crew members, whose primary responsibility was the safety and well-being of the 328 passengers in their charge. Some distance away, being parked on the opposite side of the airport, US Air Flight 1170, a Boeing 737-300, was at the very same time also finalising its preparations in advance of departure. Seated on its flight deck would be Captain Henry Jones and First Officer Jim Danaher. They would also be joined by 3 additional cabin crew members and 103 passengers, bringing the combined total of souls on board both aircraft to 448. A short time later, doors closed, US Air 1170 was given push clearance to face southwest in anticipation of a departure from runway 09. O'Shea, on the other hand, in calling for his pushback clearance, informed the ground controller that his aircraft was too heavy for a departure off runway 09. And as such, given the relatively close proximity of their parking position to runway 15 right, he was requesting it for departure instead. Moments later, his request was acknowledged, with 132 being subsequently pushed to face northwest. As attempts were being made to free up stands for incoming arrivals, those aircraft which had pushed and were subsequently being delayed due to the inclement weather further south were having to be held remotely, mostly on the taxiways between the 2 parallel runways of 04 left and 04 right. Once there, considerable time and effort was being expended in trying to correctly sequence them, so that as airports gradually reopened and started to accept flights, they were in a good position to take advantage of the improving situation. If Washington, for example, was showing signs of reopening, it was pointless having its departures sequence number 4 or 5 in line, if those ahead of it were going nowhere. The whole process from an ATC perspective was messy, labour-intensive and more than a little challenging, but they were getting on with the job at hand as best they could, given the sheer volume of traffic that ATC were having to contend with. The team of 8 controllers on duty in the tower that evening were assigned to numerous different operational roles. 1 had been assigned flight data, another clearance delivery, 2 had been assigned to manage ground movements, while 1 was tasked with solely managing helicopter operations into, out of, and in the vicinity of the airport. There was a tower coordinator, and importantly 2 controllers managing arrivals and departures, all being overseen by a senior controller operating as supervisor. In the context of the mishap which was about to happen, it was the interaction between the 2 controllers managing arrivals and departures which proved to be of greatest importance. In order to differentiate between the 2, 1 was identified as Local Controller East, or LCE, the other Local Controller West, or LCW, with their titles providing an insight as to their respective operational responsibilities. The designated East Controller, in this instance Ayaz Gulal-Kagzi, was tasked with responsibility for aircraft operations off runway 04 right and 09, whereas his colleague, Rebecca Larson, in this instance as designated West Controller, was responsible for all movements off runway 04 left and 15 right. With the layout of Logan being what it is, these runways intersect each other at various locations across the airfield, and thus it goes without saying that diligent, proactive and effective coordination between the 2 controllers is essential, so that, metaphorically, neither steps on the other's toes. In order to mitigate against any such possibility, the interaction between the 2 controllers was to follow a clearly defined set of procedural rules. Specifically, where the West controller's intention was to depart traffic off runway 15 right, as was her intention with the Aer Lingus A330. Tower rules stipulated that she was firstly obliged to request such a release from the East controller using defined, unambiguous terminology. Thus, with the aircraft in position and ready to roll, she would reach out to the East controller over the interphone, and in this instance call out, "Request release runway 15 right, Shamrock 132. Once the East controller was in a position to allow movement of the traffic on 15 right, without it creating a conflict with any of the traffic under his control, he was obliged to reply in a similarly formal manner, stating Shamrock 132 observed and released runway 15 right, at which time the West controller was free to issue the relevant takeoff clearance, confident in the knowledge that operations on all other runways had been temporarily suspended in order to mitigate against the possibility of any potential conflict. Cagsey stated that under such circumstances his personal habit was to turn over the flight strip for the next departure off runway 09. An aide-memoir, so to speak, that he had temporarily relinquished control to the West controller and was thus to refrain from any further activity on his departure runway until the departure from 15 right was observed to be airborne. Having observed the aircraft lift off, it was understood that the East controller would resume his operations once again, without the need for any further dialogue. Cagsey would recall later that this interaction between the East and the West controllers would have happened more or less continuously over the course of that afternoon and evening. Both controllers were conscious of the fact that any significant backlog of departures from runway 15 right would effectively shut down access to the signature general aviation ramp, and as such they were motivated to keep the line moving. This was often easier said than done, however, given the sheer volume of radio calls being made. Larson testified that she had frequently found it difficult to get a word in edgeways. Indeed, such was the case with her attempts to get 132 airborne. Having cleared the 330 to taxi into position and hold on runway 15 right, she was forced to wait a further 11 minutes with the jet in position before an opportunity arose to request the necessary release from the East controller, at which time Cagsey formally notified Larson that he had indeed observed and released 15 right Shamrock 132 KI, the KI suffix confirming in the noise-saturated tower that the instruction had indeed come from him. Larson, using the same short-handed code, responded with her initials RL as confirmation that she had understood she was now clear to proceed with 132's departure. Larson informed O'Shea that his aircraft would be released once the American 757 just touching down on runway 04 right had cleared that runway's intersection with 15 right, and with another aircraft following at 3 miles, he was to be ready.
Shamrock 132 Heavy, I have that one crossing and I have one arrival to the crossing runway. It will be American 757. You'll see him shortly. Be ready.
We're ready, Shamrock 132 Heavy.
O'Shea acknowledged her instruction and brought the power up on the jet's 2 massive General Electric CF6 engines while holding her steady on the brakes. Coincidentally, at the same time, Cagsey received a release for the Delta Airlines shuttle, who had been waiting in line patiently for weather conditions at LaGuardia in New York to improve. Now that his release had come through, Cagsey was eager to get him airborne so that he could clear some of the backlog that he was looking at from his vantage point in the tower. In his way, though, was US Air Flight 1170, which by this time had completed its pushback and taxi to runway 09. Indeed, being unrestricted, it had already been lined up on runway 09 for its departure to Philadelphia. 46 seconds after receiving release from Cagsey as LCE, Larson cleared O'Shea for takeoff.
Shamrock 132 Heavy, start bringing your power up traffic. I see only on 3 mile final for crossing runway, wind 080 at 4. Runway 15 right, clear for takeoff.
Clear for takeoff, 132 Heavy.
Acknowledging the clearance, he released the aircraft's parking brake and the 330 began to slowly accelerate down the length of runway 15 right. Preoccupied with getting the Delta MD-82 airborne, without thinking a mere 5 seconds after Larsen had cleared 132 for takeoff, in what was a momentary total lapse in concentration, and cleared 1170 to do the same.
Takeoff traffic 2 up for the crossing. Service takeoff, yes sir, 1170 rolling.
As Jones released the 737's brakes, powered up and commenced its takeoff roll down runway 09, O'Shea and Egan were continuing to pick up speed as their 330 continued its takeoff roll down 15 right. Both aircraft had now inadvertently been set on a collision course, and none of the 8 controllers in the tower, nor the 4 pilots involved, was any the wiser. In splitting tower operations between the 2 controllers, each had been assigned an independent control frequency, with neither controller being in a position to monitor the other's transmissions. In other words, although 2 simultaneous takeoff clearances had just been issued, Larsen had not heard Kagsi's transmission to 1170, and with the level of activity in the tower at the time, had simply never noticed 1170 starting to roll on runway 09. As well as the 2 controllers being unaware of the developing situation, the 2 crews were likewise completely in the dark for the very same reason. Each had been working a different tower frequency, and furthermore, given the physical layout of the terminal buildings at Logan, it was physically impossible for 2 aircraft simultaneously at the thresholds of runway 15 right and 09 to actually see each other, with both aircraft now rapidly converging on the point of intersection of the 2 runways. A potential disaster was now only seconds away. Danaher's post-incident testimony captured the chilling drama of what happened next.
After calling V1, I noticed an Aer Lingus A330 rotate just prior to the intersection of 15 right and 09. I shouted, "Keep it down!" and pushed the control column forward to prevent the captain from rotating the aircraft. The Airbus passed over our heads with very little separation, and once clear of the intersection, the captain rotated and we lifted off, very much towards the end of the runway. I reported to departure control that we had had a near miss, with the Aer Lingus crew concurring.
Jones' recollection was similar.
Immediately following the V1 call, the PM stated, "Keep it down." At that instance, I noticed an Aer Lingus A330 rotating on runway 15 right. At this point, the only option was to continue the takeoff roll so as to pass under the Airbus. I elected not to reject since V1 had been called and that any attempt to do so would be unsuccessful, and so our takeoff roll was continued through the intersection of runways 09 and 15 right. When we were clear of the conflicting Airbus, the PM stated, "Rotate," and I rotated for takeoff.
At 19:40 and 3 seconds local, finally alert to the developing situation but powerless to intervene, the tower's tapes recorded a panicked expletive from Kagsi.
No, no, no!
With a second, unidentified voice, classically understating,
Christ, that was close.
1170, contact Charger. 1170, roger. 4000 is 1170. 70 expedite 37000. Expedite to 7 US Air 1170. Probably no need to say so for US Air 1170, but just for the record, there was a near miss there on takeoff. 1170, roger. US Air 1170, currently getting 200. 200, US Air 1170. 132 Heavy, traffic no traffic, climb and maintain 6000. I'm at 6000, showing 132 Heavy. 1170, traffic no factor, and flighting 200, and maintain 14,000. Okay, 200 and up to 14, yes, 1170. Yeah, I need to give you the phone number for the tower for you to call when you land, when you're ready to copy. 1170, go ahead. 1170 is 617-569-1209. Okay, got it. Shamrock 132 Heavy approach. Yeah, I got that. Thank you, Shamrock 132 Heavy. Yeah, for you to call that number as well when you land Shamrock 132 Heavy. You need to copy it, is that right? I copy the number, yes. Shamrock 132 Heavy, maintain 14,000, contact approach 120.6. 120.6, Shamrock 132 Heavy. Yes, sir, 1170, contact approach 120.6. 1206, yes, sir, 1170.
Kagsy, Larson and a number of other senior supervisory controllers were all formally interviewed on June 17th, 8 days after the incident. Aware that the line of aircraft awaiting departure off runway 15 right was starting to back up, Kagsy stated that he identified a window of opportunity whereby he could ease that pressure, and remembered calling Larson in her position as LCW stating Shamrock 132 observed and released runway 15 right, meaning that he had formally given permission for her to roll the Aer Lingus A330, which he had been holding in position. Under such circumstances, while 15 right was in use, he reiterated that he was aware of his obligation to temporarily suspend departures from runway 09 in order to avoid any potential conflict. As an aide-memoire, so to speak, he said that having authorised a departure from 15 right, his personal practice was to physically turn the flight strip for his next 09 departure upside down, as a reminder that 15 right was now indeed active. When asked if he had adhered to this practice with regard to US Air 1170's strip, he stated that he was unsure, but suspected that he had. He explained that operations in the tower that afternoon had been exceptionally busy. There were so many aircraft being issued with amended departure times and amended en route clearances, 88 in total, that he had found himself almost constantly updating the information on their individual flight strips, meaning that there had been a lot of strip management and movement, far more than usual. Add to that the fact that only 8 controllers were actually on duty in the tower at the time of the incident, as compared to the normal complement of 11, meant that, challenging as it already was, the operational situation was being made a whole lot worse, given that the tower was technically undermanned. In addition to his previous mitigating actions, Kagsy went on to further testify that normally before issuing any aircraft or takeoff clearance off of runway 09, he would automatically conduct a visual sweep of the airport environment in a clockwise direction. This sweep would include the other control positions, runways, and ASDE or airport surveillance detection equipment, a de facto radar depiction of aircraft ground movements. However, with regard to US Air 1170, before releasing it for takeoff, as he turned to observe runway 15 right, his view of the runway had been physically blocked by another controller standing in his way. As such, he never actually saw the A330 as it accelerated down 15 right. Apparently unperturbed and conscious of his still high workload, he went straight back to moving aircraft and getting others ready for departure, stating that he only caught sight of the 2 aircraft as they passed the intersection. Much of the problems that evening, he believed, had been caused by the changing traffic management initiatives and the position of aircraft in their staging areas. As a result, many of the tasks he was performing were non-standard, with a lot of heads down time and associated flight strip management. With all the communication and noise this had generated in the tower at the time, it was obvious that their normal procedures had broken down, but he was unable to say exactly why. In short, having authorised Larson to release Shamrock 132 off runway 15 right, during the intervening 45 seconds or so, before this could actually happen, he had become distracted and had simply forgotten that he had actually done so. Instead, he inadvertently recommenced operations off of runway 09, as if the conversation between himself and Larson had never even taken place. For her part, Larson likewise testified that conditions in the tower that evening were, to use her own words, crazy busy, with noise levels being higher than she could ever remember. She stated that she hadn't been on duty all that long before the incident occurred. When she had come on duty, she recalled there being a lot of communication centred around multiple ongoing delays, with aircraft parked up on taxiways right across the airport environment. In addition to all that, she had been handed a line of international departures all too heavy to use runway 09, which had been holding short, awaiting a window of opportunity to get airborne from the southeasterly runway. She remembers eventually getting a word in edgeways with Kagsy, reminding him that she had several aircraft she was hoping to get airborne off runway 15 right, and that her line of traffic was starting to grow. He, however, had stated that he still had a number of aircraft with traffic management assigned departure times, and that these had priority over the departures waiting for runway 15 right. In other words, she would have to wait. Having spotted a potential gap, she recalled asking Kagsy if she could let her aircraft, that being the Aer Lingus A330, go after the American 757, which was just about to land on runway 04 right. Cagsey turned, acknowledged her request and issued the release. Shamrock 132 observed and released runway 15 right. On obtaining the release, Larson said that she had told O'Shea to bring up the power and be ready. He acknowledged, and as the 757 cleared the intersection of 04 right and 15 right, she issued the 330 with its takeoff clearance. Not unlike Cagsey, Larson also had a personal habit of scanning the full length of the active and crossing runways, as well as visually checking for the next inbound arrival, in advance of issuing any takeoff clearance. She was confident that this is exactly what she had done on the day, and once observing that the Shamrock had commenced its takeoff roll, she recalled redirecting her attention back to managing the other aircraft in her charge. Larson stated that having been forced to wait some additional 45 seconds after receiving Cagsey's release for the American 757 to clear the intersection with runway 15 right, she had deliberately called out rolling as O'Shea released the 330's parking brake and commenced the jet's acceleration. She stated that she had done this off intercom, but nonetheless in a loud voice. No one responded, nor was there a procedural requirement to do so. In truth, she thought nothing of it at the time, but upon reflection she believed it was possible that no one had actually heard her, given the level of background noise in the tower at the time, and as such, a golden opportunity to intervene had been lost. Furthermore, with this level of background noise, and given the fact that she wore her radio earpiece in the right ear, with Cagsey physically standing to her right and transmitting on a frequency which she wasn't actually monitoring, she testified that she hadn't been able to hear him release 1170 for takeoff. Yet again, another opportunity to intervene having been missed. It was shortly after that, while heads down, she heard Cagsey's expletive on the radio. As she looked up, she recalled being riveted to the spot in shock, as she witnessed the 330 pass directly overhead the 737. From her perspective, separation between the two aircraft was non-existent. Tower Supervisor Stephen Quigley was also interviewed on the 17th. He testified that both Cagsey and Larson were motivated, conscientious and hard-working controllers of average ability. While stating that the volume of traffic that evening was moderate to heavy, he did nonetheless acknowledge that the operation was more complex given the ongoing weather disruption. However, that said, he confessed that he had not implemented any restrictions on overall ground movements, citing firstly the fact that he didn't believe it necessary, and secondly the fact that none of the controllers on duty had specifically asked for such. He was of the opinion that staffing levels in the tower that evening had been adequate. In his own words, not short, not over, just right. As such, he hadn't entertained any necessity to call in additional controllers and overtime. Such a request, he admitted, wouldn't have gone over well. Yes, the workload and noise were high, but he stated, that's simply the way it is. On June 29th, just over 3 weeks after the incident, Boston Tower Notice 7110.6 was issued, titled Aircraft Releases and Non-Standard Runways. In summary, this notice moved to reinforce current procedures and formalise the individual actions of controllers in an effort to mitigate against the possibility of any similar reoccurrence in the future. Specifically, the notice reiterated the fact that controllers were obliged to prohibit the use of any intersecting runway until the departure from any non-standard runway was no longer considered a factor. Furthermore, Cagsey's practice of flipping upside down the flight strip of the next departure from any intersecting runway until again the non-standard departure was no longer a factor was to become a formalised tower procedure, as was Larson's practice of verbalising out loud the fact that the non-standard departure was now rolling. However, from a personal perspective, it has to be said that given the fact that each of these items raised in the bulletin of June 29th had actually been actioned in the tower on the evening in question, yet collectively had still failed to avert a near disaster, it's difficult to understand exactly how ATC management in Boston believed that its publication would somehow improve overall operational safety. A day later, June 30th, the NTSB wrote to Miss Benita Peroni, Air Traffic Manager, Boston Airport Traffic Control Tower. In this correspondence, the Safety Board stated that in addition to the events surrounding Shamrock 132 and US Air 1170, They were concerned that their investigation had uncovered no evidence of any coordination between Cagsey and Larson with regard to the potential conflict of the 330 being released from runway 15 right, while the arriving 757 was technically still on final approach. In the absence of any communication between the two controllers with regard to these two aircraft, it appeared to them that there was thus an expectation on the part of Cagsey that Larson, in isolation, would use her good judgment to manage the situation effectively, and that simply wasn't good enough. Furthermore, they found no evidence that Larson was ever made aware of the fact that at the same time Cagsey was preparing to depart US Air 1170 from runway 09, thus concluding that given the circumstances, separation between the 737 and the A330 was completely dependent on the actions and awareness of a single controller, namely Cagsey, in his position as LCE. Again, a less than desirable outcome. Although Boston's Logan International did have an Airport Movement Area Safety System, or AMAS, installed at the time of the incident, which was designed to visually and hourly prompt controllers to respond to situations which may potentially compromise safety, its incorporated tracking software was problematic, in that it was unable to detect potential conflicts between aircraft movements on converging runways. Thus, the NTSB concluded that neither of the two controllers had any automated backup to assist with identification of a conflict of this nature. The Safety Board in conclusion thus made the following recommendations. Firstly, that the LCW be required to inform the LCE over the interphone that this traffic was rolling once the aircraft had begun to move. This coordination would provide the receiving controller with a timely reminder that the runway was in use and, if a conflicting clearance had just been issued, subsequently prompt that controller to immediately resolve that conflict. Although this recommendation was already preempted by the text of the Boston Tower Notice issued the day previous, the NTSB's insistence that this interaction be conducted specifically over the interphone was aimed to ensure that the chances of this communication being misheard, or not heard at all, was reduced to an absolute minimum. Secondly, there was a recommendation that the tower supervisor or cab coordinator monitor the frequency of the LCE or the LCW position as appropriate when they are controlling aircraft movements from a non-standard runway. Thirdly, that controllers be prohibited from positioning aircraft on an active runway unless that aircraft is expected to depart in an appropriately short time frame. The presence of any aircraft holding on a runway should, they believe, serve as a warning to all tower personnel that a departure is imminent. The Safety Board were of the belief that frequent use of extended position and hold procedures increase the likelihood of runway conflicts and may cause controllers to become desensitized to the significance of an aircraft occupying a runway. In the incident in question, Shamrock 132 was held in position on 15 right for more than 11 minutes before Larson issued its takeoff clearance. And finally, that ATC management at Boston should evaluate the feasibility of incorporating a local assist position to be used when an aircraft is departing from a non-standard runway, given the prevailing configuration. The intention would be that this additional position would provide for an additional layer of oversight and an improved ability to coordinate with other positions and facilities as appropriate. Ultimately, the NTSB's investigation concluded that the two aircraft had passed through the intersection with a lateral separation of about 240 feet or 73 metres, and vertical separation of just over 140 feet or 43 metres. A close thing for sure. To date, the worst mid-air collision in aviation history occurred on November 11, 1996, when a Saudi Arabian Boeing 747-100 outbound from New Delhi, India, collided with a Kazakhstan Ilyushin 76 inbound to the same airport, claiming the lives of all 349 people on board both aircraft. In the context of June 6, 2005, had Danaher not been alert to the presence of the 330 as it lifted off on runway 15 right and intervened to delay Jones's own rotation, in reality the two jets would likewise most probably have collided as well, with the inevitable death toll potentially surpassing that of the Indian accident by an additional 99 souls, forever marking the date in the annals of aviation history for all the wrong reasons. This is the story of aviation's worst mid-air collision that thankfully, but for the grace of God, never actually happened.